The will has already been settled, my son said, not looking at me. And I remember thinking how strange it was that no one had called me before making that decision, because I was the one who sat beside my husband for 32 years, the one who signed every paper with him, the one who knew exactly how careful he was with everything he owned. So I smiled, just slightly, and said nothing. Even when my daughter-in-law shifted in her seat, like she was waiting for me to agree, because 48 hours earlier, a man from the bank had lowered his voice and told me something that didn't match what I was hearing now. He said my name was still on every account, every asset, every document, and that my husband had updated everything just weeks before he died, which meant one thing: someone had changed something after he was gone. So I sat there at that table, watching them talk about my life like I wasn't even in the room, listening to the way they avoided details, the way they rushed past questions, the way the lawyer kept his eyes on the folder instead of me. And I realized they thought I was confused, maybe even weak, but I wasn't. I was waiting, because earlier that morning I had already made a call, already asked for copies, already found something they never expected me to see. And when I finally looked up at them, really looked, I understood exactly what they had done, and more importantly, I knew exactly how I was going to make them regret it. I did not go home after that meeting, not right away, because I knew if I stepped back into that quiet house too soon, I might let the weight of it all settle before I was ready. So instead I sat in my car in the parking lot, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching people come and go as if nothing in the world had shifted, as if lives were not quietly rewritten behind closed doors every single day. And I replayed every word they had said, every pause, every glance, not with anger, but with precision, because anger clouds things, and I needed clarity. I needed to see the pattern forming beneath the surface, and it did not take long. The way my son avoided specifics, the way my daughter-in-law answered questions that were not directed at her, the way the lawyer kept referring to summaries instead of originals, all of it pointed in the same direction. Something had been adjusted, something had been moved just enough to look legitimate on the surface, and I had been expected to accept it without question, because that is what they believed I would do. They believed grief would make me passive, that age would make me uncertain, that I would trust them the way I always had. But trust is built over time, and it can be undone in a single afternoon. And as I finally drove home, the house looked exactly the same as it had the morning before. The same curtains, the same light falling across the kitchen counter, the same chair where my husband used to sit with his morning coffee. But something had changed, not in the space itself, but in how I moved through it. I no longer walked through those rooms as someone who belonged without question. I walked through them as someone who needed to understand what had been taken and why. And I started with the smallest things: the desk drawer where we kept important papers, the cabinet where we stored old files, the folders labeled in my husband's careful handwriting. And I noticed what was missing before I noticed what remained, because absence has a way of revealing intention. There were gaps where there should not have been, spaces that had been cleared too neatly, as if someone had not only removed documents, but also the memory of them. And I did not rush. I did not call anyone. I simply sat down at the table with a notepad and began writing everything I remembered: account numbers, dates, conversations, the name of the bank officer, the timeline of the last few weeks. And as I wrote, the pieces began to align in a way that made the situation impossible to ignore. There had been movement after my husband passed, decisions made without me, and the only way that could happen was if someone had access. And access is never accidental. It is given, or it is taken, and I needed to know which one it was. So I picked up the phone and made another call, not to my son, not to my daughter-in-law, but to someone who had known my husband long before any of this, someone who understood how he handled his affairs, someone who would recognize immediately if something did not match the man they knew. And when he answered, his voice steady and familiar, I felt something settle inside me, not relief, but direction. And I asked him one simple question: whether my husband had made any changes to his will in the final weeks. And the silence that followed was not confusion, it was recognition, and that was all I needed to hear. The man on the other end of the line did not answer immediately, and that pause told me more than any explanation could have, because it was not the kind of silence that comes from uncertainty. It was the kind that comes from someone choosing their words carefully, someone realizing that what they say next matters more than they expected. And when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, lower, more deliberate. As if he understood that this conversation was no longer routine, he said that my husband had indeed made an update, but not in the way anyone had described to me. Not something that would remove me. Not something that would shift everything away from the life we had built together. And I closed my eyes for just a moment, letting that confirmation settle, because it meant what I already suspected was now something more solid, something that could not be dismissed as confusion or grief. It meant there was a version of events being presented to me that did not match reality. And that difference was not accidental. So I asked him another question, simple, direct, whether he still had access to the original documents. And again there was that pause, shorter this time, followed by a quiet yes. And he explained that copies were kept, properly archived, dated, signed, everything recorded in a way that could not be easily altered without leaving a trace. And I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not yet, but a sense of direction becoming clearer, because if there were records, then there was truth. And if there was truth, then this situation was not as final as they believed. So I thanked him, told him I might need his help soon, and when I ended the call, I sat there for a moment, staring at the wall across from me, seeing not the room itself, but the sequence of decisions that had led to this point. My son standing in that office speaking with certainty about something he had no right to finalize without me. My daughter-in-law watching closely, as if measuring my reaction, as if waiting to see whether I would question anything at all. And the lawyer, distant, careful, avoiding anything that required direct acknowledgement. And I realized then that this had been planned with an assumption, not just that I would accept it, but that I would not investigate, that I would not ask the kind of questions that force answers. And that assumption was what gave them confidence, what allowed them to move forward without hesitation. But it was also what made their position fragile, because it depended entirely on my silence. And I had already broken that silence the moment I picked up the phone. So I stood up and walked back to the desk, the one my husband had used for years, the surface still holding faint marks from where he had rested his hands. And I opened the notebook again, adding new details, names, confirmations, timelines, connecting what I had just learned to everything I had already written, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. There was a version of the will that protected me, and there was another version that did not. And the only question that remained was how one had been replaced by the other, and who had made that decision. And I did not rush to confront anyone, because confrontation without preparation only reveals what you know, and I was not ready to reveal anything yet. Instead, I moved carefully, deliberately, making another call, this time to request copies of every relevant document, every signature, every recorded change, because if someone had altered the course of something this significant, they would have left something behind, some detail that did not align perfectly, and I intended to find it, no matter how small it was. And as I sat there waiting for the first documents to be sent, I understood something with complete clarity. They believed the situation was settled, closed, finished, but in reality, it had only just begun. The first document arrived just before sunset, a digital copy sent to my email with a subject line that looked ordinary enough to anyone else. But to me it felt like the beginning of something far more revealing, and I did not open it immediately, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because I wanted to approach it the right way, without rushing, without letting emotion interfere with what needed to be a clear and careful examination. So I made a cup of coffee, sat down at the same table where I had spent years reviewing bills and plans with my husband, and only then did I open the file, scrolling slowly, line by line, not searching for anything dramatic, but for consistency, for alignment with the man I knew. And at first glance, everything seemed in order. The formatting was correct, the legal language precise, the structure familiar. But as I continued reading, small details began to stand out, subtle differences that might have gone unnoticed if I had not known exactly how meticulous my husband had always been. There were phrasing choices he would not have used, sections that felt condensed where he would have insisted on clarity, and most importantly, dates that did not align with the timeline I had written down earlier. And I paused there, letting that realization settle, because dates are not subjective. They do not shift based on interpretation. They either match or they do not. And in this case, they did not. So I opened my notebook, checked the information, and saw it clearly. The version I had been shown at the office could not be the same as the one referenced in these records. which meant there were at least two versions in circulation, and only one of them could be legitimate. And I leaned back in my chair, thinking not about confrontation, not yet, but about sequence, about how this had been executed. Because something like this does not happen in a single moment. It requires timing, access, and a level of confidence that comes from believing you will not be challenged. And that brought my thoughts back to the days just before my husband passed, the visitors who came and went, the brief conversations I was not always part of, the moments when I had stepped out of the room, trusting that everything was as it should be. And I realized then how easily trust can be used as an opening, not broken in a loud or obvious way, but adjusted quietly, piece by piece, until the outcome serves someone else's intention. And I returned my attention to the document, continuing to read, marking each inconsistency, each detail that did not fit, building a picture that was becoming more complete with every page. And when I reached the signature section, I stopped again, not because the signature itself looked unfamiliar, but because the context around it did not make sense. The date, the witnesses, the sequence of events, it all pointed to a moment that did not align with what I knew to be true. And I understood then that this was not simply a misunderstanding or an administrative error. It was something more deliberate, something constructed with care, but not with enough precision to withstand scrutiny. And that realization did not make me angry. It made me focused, because now I had something concrete, something that could be verified, something that could be challenged in a way that would require answers. And I closed the document, not with a sense of conclusion, but with the understanding that this was only the first piece, and that somewhere among the remaining records, the full story was waiting to be uncovered. The next set of documents arrived late that night, and this time I did not wait. I opened them immediately, not out of impatience, but because I had already prepared myself for what I might find. And as the pages loaded one by one, I noticed something that was far more telling than any missing signature or altered date. It was the pattern, the way certain changes were clustered within a narrow window of time, all occurring after my husband had passed, all executed with a level of coordination that suggested this was not a single decision, but a sequence of actions, each one building on the last. And I leaned closer to the screen, reading carefully, tracing the timeline, because when events are placed in order, intention becomes visible. And what I saw was not random. Accounts were updated, access permissions were shifted, documents were requested and processed in quick succession, and every one of those actions required authorization, required someone to initiate them. And I did not need to guess who that someone might be, because there were names attached, names I recognized, names that had been present in that office earlier. And I felt something settle deeper inside me, not shock, not even disappointment, but a quiet understanding that this had gone further than I initially thought, that it was not just about a single document being replaced. It was about control being transferred, piece by piece, in a way that would be difficult to reverse if no one questioned it. And I moved through the file slowly, marking each entry, noting each inconsistency, building a record that could not be dismissed as coincidence, because patterns do not lie. They reveal what individual moments try to hide. And as I reached the final page, I noticed something that made me pause again, a reference to a document that I had not yet seen, something labeled as a finalized version, dated just days after my husband's passing. And I sat back, considering that detail, because finalization implies closure, implies that everything had been reviewed, confirmed, agreed upon, and yet I had never been part of that process, never been asked to review anything, never been given the opportunity to confirm or deny what was being presented. And that absence was not an oversight. It was a choice, and choices like that are rarely made without purpose. So I closed the file and turned my attention to the notes I had been keeping, aligning this new information with what I already knew. And the picture became clearer. There was an original structure that protected me, and then there was a series of actions that altered that structure after the fact, creating a version that excluded me. And the only way that could stand was if I accepted it without question, if I allowed their version to become the only version. And that was not going to happen. But I also knew that moving too quickly would only give them time to adjust, to explain, to create reasons that might sound convincing to someone who did not have all the details. So I needed to move carefully, deliberately, gathering everything before taking the next step. And I reached for the phone again, not to confront, not yet, but to request the one thing that would bring all of this into focus, the original signed copy, the one that existed before any of these changes were made. Because if I had that, if I could place it beside what they had shown me, then the difference would not be a matter of interpretation. It would be undeniable. And as I waited for a response, I realized that whatever they believed they had secured, whatever they thought was already settled, was resting on a foundation that was beginning to crack. The response did not come immediately, and that delay told me just as much as anything written in those documents. Because when something is simple, it moves quickly, but when it requires consideration, when it needs to be handled carefully, there is always a pause, and I understood that whoever received my request knew exactly what I was asking for, not just a copy, but the version that existed before anything had been altered, the version that would not align with the story I had been given. So I waited, not idly, but with purpose, reviewing everything again, making sure there were no gaps in my understanding, no assumptions that could weaken what I was building. And as I sat there in the quiet of that house, I thought about how easily this could have gone differently, how I could have accepted their explanation, how I could have allowed the situation to close around me without ever knowing what had been done. And that thought did not make me angry. It made me aware of how important each decision had been, each choice to question instead of accept, to verify instead of assume. And when my phone finally rang, I answered without hesitation, recognizing the number before I even looked at the screen, and the voice on the other end was steady, professional, but there was something else there as well, something that suggested this was no longer just a routine request. He confirmed that the original document had been located, that it was intact, properly recorded, and that its contents were consistent with what my husband had intended. And I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, because hearing it confirmed out loud made everything that followed unavoidable. There was now a clear line between what was true and what had been presented to me, and that line could not be erased, so I asked him to send it, not as a summary, not as a reference, but as a complete copy, every page, every signature, every detail. And when the file arrived, I opened it immediately, no hesitation this time, because I already knew what I would find, and as I read through it, the differences were not subtle, they were precise, intentional, structured in a way that reflected the man I had known, the man who had made sure I was protected, who had planned carefully, who had never left anything unfinished or unclear, and my name was there, exactly where it should have been, not minimized, not reduced, but central, acknowledged, secured in a way that could not be mistaken. And I let that sit for a moment, not out of emotion, but to fully understand what it meant, because this was not just about a document. It was about a deliberate attempt to replace something real with something constructed, something designed to appear legitimate while removing me from the outcome. And I returned to my notes, placing this version alongside the one I had been shown, comparing them line by line, not rushing, not skipping ahead, because every difference mattered, every inconsistency added weight to what I already knew. And as the comparison unfolded, the pattern became undeniable, sections removed, language altered, beneficiaries adjusted, all within a time frame that made it clear this had been done after my husband was no longer able to confirm or deny any of it. And I sat back, looking at both versions in front of me, understanding that this was no longer a question of suspicion, it was a matter of proof. And proof changes everything, because it does not rely on interpretation, it does not depend on emotion, it simply exists, waiting to be presented at the right moment, and I knew that moment was coming, but not yet, because timing matters just as much as evidence, and if I moved too soon, I would give them the opportunity to prepare, to explain, to reshape the narrative once again. So instead, I closed the documents, placed them carefully beside my notebook, and allowed the silence of the room to settle around me, knowing that for the first time since this began, I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I already knew, and now the only thing left was deciding how to reveal it. The next morning, I did something they would never expect. I called my son and invited him to dinner. Nothing formal, nothing unusual, just a quiet evening at the house, the same kind of invitation I had extended hundreds of times before. And when he answered, there was a brief hesitation in his voice, not enough for someone unfamiliar to notice, but enough for me, because hesitation always reveals more than words. And I kept my tone calm, steady, as if nothing had changed, as if I had accepted everything exactly as it had been presented, and he agreed, quickly after that pause, almost too quickly, as if he wanted to move past the moment before it could become something else. And I ended the call with the same softness I had always used, because consistency is what makes people lower their guard. And throughout the day, I prepared as I always did, setting the table, arranging everything with the same care, the same attention to detail, not because I was pretending, but because routine has a way of creating comfort, and comfort makes people careless. And that was what I needed, not confrontation, not yet, but observation. So when they arrived that evening, I welcomed them the same way I always had, a quiet smile, a simple greeting, nothing that would suggest I had spent the last 2 days uncovering the truth they believed was hidden. And I watched them as we sat down, the way my son avoided direct questions, the way my daughter-in-law filled the silence with casual conversation, steering topics away from anything that required specifics, and I let it happen. I let them believe that the conversation would remain on safe ground, that I would not challenge them. And as the meal continued, I introduced a single question, carefully placed, not direct, not accusatory, just enough to shift the tone slightly, asking about the timeline, about when everything had been finalized, and I saw it again, that same flicker, that same moment of adjustment, my son answering too quickly, my daughter-in-law adding details that did not quite align, and I nodded, as if their explanation made sense, as if I had no reason to question it, because the goal was not to confront them in that moment. The goal was to confirm what I already knew, to watch how they handled pressure, even a small amount. And the more they spoke, the clearer it became. Their story was consistent only on the surface, but beneath it, there were gaps, inconsistencies that grew more visible with every additional detail. And I did not interrupt. I did not correct them. I simply listened, letting them build their version of events in front of me, because the more they said, the more they committed to it, and commitment makes it harder to change direction later. And when the conversation drifted back to something neutral, I let it go. I did not push further, because pushing too hard would have revealed my position, and that was not what I wanted, not yet. So the evening ended as quietly as it had begun. They left believing everything was still under control, that I had accepted their explanation, that there was nothing more to discuss, and I stood at the door, watching them walk away, knowing that every word they had spoken would matter. Every detail they had given would be measured against the truth I now held. And as I closed the door, the house returned to silence. But it was no longer the same silence as before. It was no longer empty. It was filled with certainty, because I had seen enough, heard enough, confirmed enough to know that what they had built could not hold, not once it was examined properly. And now it was only a matter of choosing the moment when everything would be brought into the open. The following day, I did not contact them. I did not ask for another meeting, and I did not mention anything about what I had discovered, because silence, when used correctly, creates a false sense of safety, and safety makes people predictable. So instead, I focused on preparation, reviewing every document again, not just reading, but understanding the structure behind them, how each change connected to the next, how each adjustment depended on the one before it. And I began to map it out, dates, names, actions, placing everything in sequence until there were no gaps left, until the entire process became visible from beginning to end. And what I saw was not a mistake, it was a plan, executed with enough care to appear legitimate, but not enough to withstand careful scrutiny. And that difference was what I would rely on, because it meant I did not need to argue. I did not need to accuse. I only needed to present, and the truth would do the rest. But timing still mattered, because if I revealed everything too soon, they would have time to respond, to adjust, to create explanations that might complicate what should remain simple. So I needed a setting where everything would be clear, structured, and documented, a place where words carried weight and could not be easily dismissed. And there was only one place that fit that requirement. So I made the call, not to them, but to the office, requesting a formal follow-up meeting, asking for all parties to be present, including the lawyer, framing it as a simple need for clarification, nothing confrontational, nothing that would raise concern. And when the confirmation came, I felt a quiet certainty settle in, not anticipation, not satisfaction, but readiness, because now there would be a moment, a defined point in time where everything would be placed side by side. The version